All right, everyone, welcome to the panel about NFT infrastructure. So here we have with us Shannon from LivePeer, Jonathan from Protocol Labs, and Carson from Tableland. And maybe the best way is to let each of you introduce yourself for, let's say, like 1 minute, and then we start.
Sure. Hey, I'm Shannon. I'm head of growth at LivePeer, and LivePeer is a decentralized video infrastructure protocol. So we decentralize video transcoding, which is actually the most important technical step to put video on the internet. Transcoding video makes sure that you can receive it on any device anywhere in the world, and currently that technology is highly centralized, and I'm really excited on this panel to talk about why decentralizing internet infrastructure matters for creators who put content on the web.
Hey everybody, my name is Jonathan Victor. I lead NFT and gaming growth at Protocol Labs. Protocol Labs is a research, development, and deployment lab. We focus on open source technologies, primarily on storage. So some of the protocols that we work on with other folks like Carson and the textile team are IPFS, Filecoin, and libp2p. All of these sort of are part of a peer-to-peer stack of how do we build a decentralized web. So when you have a link, the link isn't pointing just at one server somewhere, but how do we have the internet allow users to ask the internet for data and have the data be served back? And how do we get guarantees that that data is actually available somewhere rather than hoping that maybe one computer somewhere stays online? So I'm sure we'll get into that more, but yeah, I'll pass it to Carson.
Cool. Yeah, so my name is Carson Farmer. I am from the Tableland team and part of the textile team that sort of incubates Tableland. So Tableland is a decentralized network of validators that support dynamic NFT metadata. So this is the type of data that you use to represent traits and rarities and all the exciting things that you can do with NFTs. And a big piece of what we do is supporting mutable states. So like as your NFT evolves over time, how does that change the representation both visually and in terms of the underlying data? And so, you know, if you think about where we're at with NFTs and supporting sort of NFT creators, we've kind of slowly moving along a trend of like, you know, one-dimensional sort of boring basic NFTs to two-dimensional images to three-dimensional like metaverse experiences to four-dimensional video and experiences to beyond where we're starting to see like very dynamic changing environments where NFTs are doing a lot more work on behalf of their owners. And so building out that infrastructure so that developers can actually make those cool experiences is, I think, all about what the team on this panel is really interested in getting into. So there you go.
I want to introduce our moderator. Lily is actually the founder of NFT Berlin. Lily, do you want to talk a little bit about your background in NFTs?
Yeah, sure. About NFT Berlin? About
your background in NFTs.
Oh, my background in NFTs. Okay, so it started since 2018. I was working on NFT analytics back then, and we had a solid 200 users in 2018. It didn't really work out back then, but then I have been building like a lot of products in the space, and the last thing that I was doing was the NFT Berlin, an event quite similar to NFT.NYC happened in Berlin. Yeah. So happy to be here. So let's get started talking about NFT infrastructure. Well, the first use case on Ethereum was launched in DevCon 1 in London 2015. But I would say the most widely used standard is ERC 721 that was launched in 2017. Since then until today, we're still using the same standard, right? But the difference is that we have like so many more use cases, which means we have many more stakeholders in the space, from the creator and not only developers. We also have, for example, new use cases like fractionalization, music, even like research, IP rights funding. Yeah, so I would say one of the question that I would like to ask you guys, like because you're like representing the infrastructure of the NFT, is that what do you think is the next big thing in NFT infrastructure?
I think the next big thing is creators actually becoming more aware of what Web3 is from a technology perspective. I think, you know, there's been such an influx of new talent and creators into the crypto space over the last year, but I think there's not often an understanding of, how the technology actually shifts and what it means to go from Web 2 to Web 3. And maybe just to pause on that difference between, what is Web 3 versus what is Web 2. In Web 2, creators, continue to get a pretty bad deal. Why big internet companies like Google and Facebook have to monetize user data is because their infrastructure costs are so high. YouTube had to sell to Google because it couldn't cover its costs. Twitch is still operating at a loss. And what that means for creators is if you want to use YouTube, you have to, try and appeal to the widest possible audience. And when you shift to a Web3 world where, the technology is decentralized, and as a result, like the business model of the internet fundamentally shifts because your costs can come down and it's infinitely scalable. Front-end platforms don't have to monetize user data. And that is, partially what allows creators to participate in front-end platforms where they can, survive on a much smaller but deeper engaged audience.
Maybe to sort of piggyback off that a little bit, one way I like to think about Web3 is like the ability to exit is the main test, where if it's Web3, then there's an ability to take your car or cards and go home. Like you aren't required to stay inside of one platform or one service. You have the ability to switch around. And it's interesting, so I would say I have actually two, where do I see things going? One is, I don't know if people saw like 2 weeks ago, I think, Salesforce announced that they're going to enable NFTs now on their platform, which is great from like a Web 2 company now embracing Web 3 technologies. I think an important question is, well, what happens if Salesforce decides it's a business model they don't want to support anymore? Are they going to continue running those servers? And if you're doing things in a Web 2 way, the URL, the way that that NFT is pointing at its image or all the other metadata, well, that's now like locking the users into having Salesforce support that business model. So if they walk away, the NFT might break. But if you do things in a more Web3 way, where instead of saying, hey, this has to be tied to Salesforce server, instead it's tied to like a fingerprint of the content, then, and this is how IPFS works, then it doesn't matter if Salesforce wants to walk away. The user can own their own data. They can take over running the service. They can pay someone else to do it. It gives the user flexibility, but it also gives Salesforce flexibility. And I think one of the big trends that I'm pretty optimistic about is Web 2 companies realizing that this ability to exit and not forcing users into a position is also to their benefit as well, where it gives them optionality. So that's big thing number one, I think. And especially as we see more institutions, probably in this audience as well, coming to this space to learn more. I'm optimistic that we'll see that. The other is, I think, Web3 has gone through this massive ramp in the number of folks who are coming here to build. And so we've seen that with NFTs, where artists are learning things that they may not have been familiar with before. They're learning about cryptography, how to manage their keys. And I think part of the sharp edges that we see is because although we have a lot of really interesting and powerful technology, it's still quite early. And so when we start thinking about, well, what can an NFT be? We want to ask the questions of like, not constrained by the technology as it exists today, but what the technology could be. So when we think about an NFT is just a digital bearer object, that could be anything. It could be an image, it could be a video, but it could be something like a whole metaverse world. And so really making sure that the technology isn't getting in the way of people building the things that they want to build, I think that's hopefully where we're going to see more of that. On IPFS and Filecoin, we think about this much more from the scalability side, where how do we make Web3 primitives accessible and not restricting when we want to build things that are larger, more expansive, more integrated. But I know also when we think about what are the use cases for NFTs, especially in gaming, I don't know who played Pokemon growing up, but you had a little Charmander Pokemon. That could be an NFT that evolves to a Charizard. And doing that requires something like mutability. So yeah, I'm super optimistic. I think the next big trend is going to be all the technologists at the base layer pushing hard to make sure that we are not the limiting factor in people's creativity.
So I love that answer, and I'm going to kind of like really borrow off of it, because as an infrastructure layer provider, my answer to like what's the next big thing is really like, I don't know. That's not my job. My job is to get out of the way and make sure that I facilitate that next big thing. And I definitely think this whole idea of like, let's get out of the way, provide rock solid infrastructure and all of the building blocks to really explore and experiment. That is my job as an infrastructure layer provider. And so that's what I'm excited about. Like, I love tinkering with databases and SQL and figuring out how I'm going to like scale this, dynamism, and then sitting back and watching someone build an amazing game experience. And just to sort of like jump off of that, I had this awesome conversation with someone yesterday at a side event about NFTs in games. And I was kind of, I was on board with the idea, yeah, NFTs in games is a great idea, pretty neat. But it hadn't occurred to me how neat of an idea this is when you start to layer on all of these different components that the infrastructure layer can provide. And he gave this amazing example of, he played this game for like 15 years. It was a text-based like console game. And then one day he just decided, you know what, I probably should be spending more time with my kids, so not really going to play this game anymore. And he just stopped. And then that character basically, and all the XP points that he developed and built up along the way, they're just gone. But he was like, but imagine now if I was building on your platform and when I hit like stop, I actually updated the state of that character. I dynamically, set the metadata for that character, and then I could sell that off to someone and say, look, you keep going, you keep building this experience, you keep developing this character in totally new ways. And he said, I wouldn't sell it for very much, but just knowing that someone else could take that and keep moving and keep exploring and keep being dynamic is something that it kind of was like, whoa, that's the type of thing that I want to facilitate as an infrastructure provider. Like, I never would have thought of that because I'm not a gamer who's been playing a game for a long time. But I did think about some of the tools that he would need to make that possible. And that's I think, what's cool about being an infra provider for that is I don't need to figure out exact use cases. I just need to build those building blocks. And I think that's, video dynamism and like all this stuff is what's coming, and I hope that it's stuff I can't even think of.
Maybe just to tag on one other thing that sparked in my brain, I think like one thing that I find really interesting about NFTs, especially if you look at the critics, a lot of times they're like, it's just JPEGs. And I feel like there's sometimes this sort of like hesitance or like something like a mental block about like why are NFTs different from just like images or anything else. And I think part of that is it doesn't have like the physics of the real world because we know digital objects can be infinitely replicable. There's like a bunch of different ways that it feels different. And so it doesn't feel the same as like if someone creates a sculpture in the real world where you can see all the effort that went into this thing and it's like a unique item that sits in your hand. I think the cool thing when we start thinking about these decentralized systems is we can bring some of those properties into the digital world. And that isn't to say that we do it for like a cash grab or whatever else, but like that character is like a labor of love. And like having the ability to imbue that with like actual meaning where like you do have the scarcity of this is a unique thing that I've built up and it had this much of my life force injected into it is actually a meaningful thing. And I think people don't appreciate it today because we don't have those primitives. But I think that's what a lot of this decentralized infrastructure enables.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But then when you were talking about optionality, which I like, right? Like we're gonna have big players coming in the next years, and obviously they're gonna come into space, bringing their business logic into the space. So before they like start making the decision for us, I would like to hear from you guys what is actually an ideal NFT infrastructure would look like. And this could also be including the incentive layer, the community, the DAO layer, because all of these, the infrastructure basically being created to enable all of these use cases, right? What would it be, the ideal case for you guys?
I mean, I think it's anything that enables the creator to literally own their data. So I think there's I'm curious who here's minted an NFT or purchased an NFT. Okay, how many of you know where that data is stored? Okay, so not quite as many. I mean, that's the big unlock of like why, we're all in this space. Like there's an NFT platform on Tezos called it's called Object now, but it started about a year and a half ago. This coder in Brazil had this idea to spin up an NFT platform. It really took off because Tezos is a carbon neutral blockchain. A lot of people who are concerned about sustainability in the NFT industry just really flocked to it. And for a few months, it was actually the highest volume trading NFT platform in the space. And there's this one dev in Brazil who all of a sudden was getting like hundreds of thousands of requests from users. And he got so overwhelmed, he backed away. And all the creators who had, minted on the platform were like, shit, like, have we lost everything? And the community was really quite concerned. And then as it turned out, like all of the NFTs were actually stored on IPFS. And so I think that the ideal is there. I think that, the storage layer is just one example of decentralized infrastructure. I think, at the platform layer, I think the ideal is that the platforms themselves are decentralized. There are very centralized NFT platforms that are still, out there today, and I think creators do need to be really mindful of, where you're minting. Do you actually end up owning that data at the end of the day? So I think the ideal use case is like something like what happened on Tezos with Hic et Nunc, that you actually are integrated with decentralized infrastructure.
Yeah, maybe to build off of that, I don't know how many people actually know the difference between IPFS and Filecoin. They're related things, but they're slightly different. So the cool thing IPFS does is it allows you to basically reference content, not based on where it lives. So it's not pointing at like johnsdropbox.com/JPEG1. Instead, it uses like a fingerprint of the content as the reference. So you can say, hey, internet, I'm looking for this specific fingerprint of the content, and whoever has it can serve it back. And so that's really powerful, like in the Hic et Nunc case, where, yeah, if one computer that has that data goes offline, another computer that's still serving it will make sure that the content's still available. So I think that's actually, one of the most important things, because it doesn't mandate where the content lives. It says that the content can come from anywhere. If you use a Brave browser, your Brave browser actually also has an IPFS node, so you could literally store and serve to the world your own content if you wanted to. You could use something like Filecoin, which is a decentralized storage network. You could use multiple decentralized storage networks. You could pay for a cloud service. And I think the powerful thing is, especially when we're thinking about content addressing, it gives us the optionality to try everything that exists today, but also maybe in the future there's some way to magically use DNA or like diamonds or something. And you can use all of these systems in tandem without sacrificing the properties of any individual one. And then Filecoin, just to explain what that is just an incentivized version of IPFS. It's slightly more complicated than that, but it uses a blockchain in a novel way to basically make sure that someone somewhere is holding onto the data, and not just by saying, I trust you that you might have the data. They have to cryptographically prove to the network every 24 hours that this data is still here, and if they do so, they get money. If they don't, they lose money. And so, yeah, the combination of these really just tries to answer this question, or two parts of the question. The first is, well, how do I know what the content is that I'm looking for, which is what IPFS gives you with that reference? And the second is, well, how do I know someone has it, which is what Filecoin gives you with their proofs? And then, yeah, I think using those primitives, it's not just saying like once you do those two things, everything's fine. When you start looking at mutability, you really don't want to sacrifice those base properties in order to also enable like that changing nature. And so that's where like a lot of the work that Carson's team is doing actually enables that, in order to say, hey, I have these immutable references, but I can migrate what the right one is over time. So yeah, I think it is tricky, but I think it's also important for artists to know, because like artists, collectors, you're the ones that the marketplaces are reacting to. And if you don't demand these things from the marketplaces, they may take shortcuts. And then it's ultimately your art or the art that you're purchasing that's going to suffer. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect way for you to end that, actually, because my like explicit answer to like what is the ideal stack for these like Web3 data and support layer protocols. The ideal stack is one in which the new incumbent marketplaces and the existing marketplaces are directly participating in those protocols. And the big, like that does come from artists and creatives saying, I want you to be supporting and using these protocols that ensure that at the end of the day, if I'm unhappy with the service you're providing, there are other service providers that I can transfer to, I can shift to, I can start minting on other platforms. And that I think it really does require those platforms to be co-running and participating directly in those decentralized protocol networks. So like I want OpenSea to be running that full stack. I want them to be running EVMs. I want them to be running LivePeer. I want them to be running Tableland. I want them to be running IPFS and even Filecoin nodes. And all of those infrastructure providers should be running that stuff together so that they get a really beautiful, snappy user experience, while at the same time contributing to the robustness and stability of the overall network. And then everyone else is running these nodes as well, and we get this like very robust network where something like this happens, where a user goes down and the nice outcome of that is that the community was able to come together, rally together, and actually recover all that stuff. But wouldn't it be nice if there wasn't that stressful moment when everybody went, oh no, and instead they just said, geez, that's too bad that you got all that. There's too much to handle, but we can shift things very quickly and sort of scale that. That's the whole point of that decentralized ethos. So, yeah, what I want to see is all the existing and new incumbent NFT marketplaces supporting those protocols that we need to maintain user control of their data from day one. So if I come in and I'm, I don't know. The next Save On Foods or some grocery store decides that they're going to make NFTs out of all their bananas, they really better be running IPFS and LivePeer in the background so that all of their creatives can make sure those bananas get where they need to right away.
That's awesome.
Maybe if I could, I think it's less about like ideal infrastructure than it is actually ideal platforms and ideal front ends and making sure they're community owned. And again, just as an example for any video creators out there who's familiar with Patreon. Okay, so yeah, Patreon is a creator platform where creators can use it as a marketplace. And so Patreon has a deal with Vimeo to be their video distribution provider. And Vimeo very recently made a business decision that it was not going to try and be the YouTube for indie creators, that it was actually going to become more of a like corporate service provider. And so it changed its business model. And it really ramped up its prices. And so the video creators who were relying on Patreon all of a sudden got this communication from Vimeo saying like, hey, we have noticed that, you are like a high cost user for us, and because we've changed your business model, your monthly subscription is gonna 5 or 6x. And if you're a small creator, like that actually has a really huge impact. And so, the other kind of like really cool thing about Web3 is like not just like this decentralized technology layer, but it's also this idea that like the platforms and the technologies that people use are actually like co-owning and governing, and you can actually like collectively as users of a platform make decisions around like, yeah, what is the infrastructure we want to use so that you avoid situations where you actually like have to be faced with a very difficult choice of paying a lot or getting off the platform.
Yeah, so I hear that provenance, immutability, it's basically main theme here, and also transferability, that you have your asset one place and it is up to you and your choice to be able to use any other platform, right? So you don't get like locked into one platform. Seems to be a trend here. So one thing that I actually personally curious about, I'm thinking about, so basically there's like NFT infrastructure, but there's like a certain type of logic, this is an open question, either like, should we have this baked in as some sort of like an open source, community objective logic that people can use, for example, how we can price NFT objectively, how we can effectively price in the risk associated, all these kind of things, which is people as a user, we go to each platform, and each platform has different way to, for example, like value each collection, which is it's cool, right? Because it's a free market, but like, should we also kind of think of in terms of risk, for example, for users, this is an open question of like, what do you guys think?
Well, so kind of related, so less so about the NFTs and their pricing, more so about like the infrastructure and how do we make sure that content doesn't disappear. So as we've been talking about, one of the cool things IPFS lets you do is it lets anyone serve that content to make sure it doesn't disappear. It could be the marketplace, it could be the artist, or it could be a third party who really cares. And so one of the projects that we've been working on in our ecosystem is this project called NFT.storage, which is literally just trying to build the internet archive for NFTs. So there's public IPFS nodes that we run. If you're running your own IPFS nodes, that's great. Just feel free to use us as an additional resource. We will also pin the content and make it available over the web. We'll push it onto Filecoin, so even if we go away, there's other nodes on the network that are still serving data. But the important part is it means we can use Web3 to create more resilience so that, like the Hicket Nunk situation, it's not like, oh, we're scrambling to fix this stuff. We actually have people who care in a community that's building around making sure NFTs are resilient. I think this gets even more powerful once we start layering in things like smart contracts to say, like, how do we create, even whether it's like a community through a DAO, which is actually something that's on our roadmap for NFT.storage, where we can bring together creators, collectors, even layer ones to like work together to make sure this content's preserved, but also thinking through how do we just automate these systems so it's not like we need one person who's monitoring these things to make sure things are renewed automatically. And I do think this is what Web3 has that Web 2 doesn't, which is we have this permissionless infrastructure that can run autonomously, where in order for a smart contract to break, you would need all of Ethereum or all of Polygon or any of these chains that they run on to stop functioning. And so that becomes extremely resilient if we start thinking about, well, how do we pair that with things like storage, as an example?
Okay, that's great. So we are like out of time here. So any one of you guys want to have, the last closing thought on, the future of NFT infrastructure?
If you're minting video NFTs or if you want to purchase video NFTs, you should check whether they are streamed on LivePeer, which is currently the decentralized video infrastructure that is permissionless, open in Web3. That's my closing statement.
Yeah, I'll have a closing statement, which is just the cool thing about the unsexy world of infrastructure and infrastructure layers is that unlike the NFTs that they're supporting, they're totally cross-chain. They may have their own chain to support, incentivizing the validators on that piece, but they're cross-chain. So if I can deploy NFTs on any platform that supports NFTs, any chain that supports NFTs, and the infrastructure layers are there to support all of those chains, or as many as they can. And so I encourage people to start thinking even more broadly about like, oh, I do my NFTs on Solana, or I do my NFTs on Polygon. You don't need to do that if you can be sure that the underlying infrastructure for the NFTs that you're deploying are going to be there no matter what. So I encourage people to start thinking like, I can really optimize for the audience that I want to capture, the user experience that I want to build or create, without thinking specifically about, or maybe by optimizing specifically for the chain that I want to deploy on. So there's this really cool infrastructure world where we've got like multiple layers that are supporting multiple other layers, and that mixing and matching is just another piece of that like composability story that we really love in Web3. And I'm not seeing a lot of that yet, so just a little precursor or maybe a suggestion for what's to come is way more cross-chain stuff when you know that infrastructure layer is there to support that cross-chain interaction.
Thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.